Welcome to the Missing Pages, where we explore science and history that you might not find in your average textbook. My name is Kausar, and my co-host Lee and I are scientists, meaning we spend a lot of our time being curious about all kinds of things, and the history of science is no exception.
Our understanding of science is built on thousands of years of knowledge from peoples all across the earth. Yet, we're often taught that scientific knowledge comes from a very limited part of the world. That's why we'll be highlighting science and history from outside of Europe that have been foundational to our understanding of our world today, and have often been left out of the story.
So whether you're a curious mind or a fellow scientist, join us on this journey in uncovering the missing pages.
Today we're going to be talking about race science. This is a really heavy topic, and it's an episode that was really challenging to put together. But it is so important for everyone to understand, regardless of the color of your skin. We're going to start by talking about eugenics back in the 1880s and how it was used in populations and kind of became popular up until World War II, when it was used in Nazi Europe to justify some really horrendous things. We're going to look at the legacy of the use of that science and even how it continues to be implemented today. Before we continue, we want to let you know that this episode contains content that can be really difficult for some people. We're going to be talking about science that was used in really violent and traumatic ways to justify things like forced sterilization, mass murder, and genocide. These are really heavy topics, and they're going to be really difficult, especially for those who are affected and were affected by these policies. What we hope you take away from this video is that science can get it really wrong sometimes, and that has real-world implications for communities. The communities that were especially affected by race science and eugenics often are equity-seeking communities who aren't part of developing and researching the science that we're talking about. This is one of the reasons why talking about this history is so important. So we thank you for continuing with us on this journey through the missing pages, and we hope that you enjoy the final episode of Season 1.
The eugenics movement was a widespread movement that flourished in many parts of the world from roughly 1880 to 1945. It emerged at the height of European imperialism and during a historical period characterized by major social turmoil and social inequality. And the main idea behind the eugenics movement was to fix social problems by making biological improvements to a nation's population. And although similar ideas had been around for centuries, the term eugenics wasn't introduced until the late 19th century, when it was coined by the British mathematician Francis Galton. And, today the eugenics label is often associated very narrowly with coercive policies that interfere with the reproductive freedom of individuals. So it's a term that carries a lot of sort of dark and emotionally charged connotations. But when Galton defined the term in the 1880s, he offered a very broad definition, and this allowed the term to become quickly popular and allowed it to travel throughout Europe, the British Empire, the US, and Latin America. So Galton defined eugenics as the science of improving the human stock and of giving the, quote, more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance to quickly prevail over the less suitable ones. So the idea of a hierarchy of races with white Europeans at the top and non-Europeans at the bottom was inherent to his definition. And similarly, the idea of an evolutionary struggle between races in which superior ones would prevail was also part of the definition and offered a convenient way to frame and excuse the violence that European empires perpetuated in their colonies.
At the end of the 19th century, scientists understood that humans inherited information from their biological parents, but they didn't know how. So for the eugenics movement, there were a few different theories that informed their work. And we actually kind of categorize these in two different ways. Eugenics practitioners who adhered to hard heredity and eugenics practitioners who adhered to soft heredity.
Historians refer to one movement as hard heredity, which used Gregor Mendel and his theory of inheritance. Advocates of this theory believed what we know now to be true, which is that genes are passed down from biological parents intact and without influence. And while the genetics may have been correct, practitioners of eugenics used hard heredity as the basis of violent eugenics laws and policies. By the 1920s, these eugenics ideas were widely accepted throughout Europe and North America.
So this more rigid conception of heredity also led eugenic experts to argue that social problems such as criminality, immorality, and what they called feeble-mindedness were heritable dispositions that wouldn't be fixed through environmental changes. So it was these rigid conceptions of heredity that led countries such as the US, Canada, and Sweden to adopt eugenic laws that allowed physicians to perform thousands of sterilization surgeries in order to prevent the reproduction of those with supposedly defective genes. And it was in Nazi Germany where lawmakers used these hereditarian assumptions to craft the most ambitious eugenics program to have ever emerged. So in the name of racial hygiene, Nazi lawmakers introduced a far-reaching law in 1933 that led to the forced sterilization of some 400,000 Germans who physicians, geneticists, psychiatrists, and anthropologists identified as having hereditary conditions that could lead to the biological degeneration of the German race.
So what I think about the legacy of race science, like the eugenics movement in academia, is for our current day, is that it continues to perpetuate stereotypes regarding different marginalized groups, racialized individuals, that they're not worthy, they shouldn't be admitted. It speaks to who the stereotypical professor or scientist should be or should not be. And unfortunately, when many of us, because we've been so socialized to imagine a scientist to be predominantly white and male, we don't think about other individuals who very much are deserving and can be in those spaces and have the intellect and ability to be a scientist. And it prevents the ability of us bringing in more and more talent into universities, whether it's students or faculty. And it also limits what we share within our curriculum. It's a legacy that has very detrimental implications and impacts on the sector. And we really have to strive to push against that and make sure that we're being as inclusive as possible within the area of many different areas of science.
The other movement referred to soft heredity, using Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's theory of genetics. This was the idea that organisms can acquire physical traits over the course of their lifetime in response to environmental pressures. We don't accept Lamarckian genetics today. However, because eugenics practitioners in the early 20th centuries did believe in it, they believed that changing a person's environment could improve the genetics of a population. We might laugh at this notion, but in fact, these ideas led to far less negative and even some positive impacts compared to hard heredity eugenics.
In the context of the eugenics movement, this Lamarckian understanding of heredity prompted experts to advocate for policies concerned with reforming institutions and supporting those that they deemed to be burdens on society, such as criminals, impoverished families, and the disabled. So for advocates of soft heredity, the so-called unfit could be redeemed and improved through environmental fixes. This is one of the things that's really interesting about the eugenics movement. It looked quite different in different parts of the world. Latin American scientists mostly rejected this way of thinking of heredity and the kind of sterilization policies that were implemented in North America. And they instead embraced the softer Lamarckian approach. So Latin American eugenicists organized themselves through a series of Pan-American conferences. And in these conferences, these experts articulated what they viewed as an alternative approach to what they called Anglo-Saxon or Nordic eugenics. So, although the views of Latin American experts were far from uniform, their approach to eugenics was typically one that emphasized the environmental fixes suggested by Lamarckian conceptions of heredity. So, for instance, one of the concepts that gained a lot of traction in Latin America as well as in Southern Europe was the notion of puericultura, or puericulture. So, like eugenics, this idea of puericulture was an open-ended one, but one that referred broadly to the scientific cultivation of children. And with this aim of cultivating normal and healthy children, eugenic experts advocated for public health measures such as the creation of child hygiene centers where physicians and nurses could preside over and ensure that children developed in a normal fashion, as well as counsel mothers on aspects of childcare and domesticity, such as breastfeeding, nutrition, disinfecting surfaces, and housekeeping.
The impact of eugenics and race science in Latin America, while not uniform, was very different from those seen in Europe, particularly Nazi Europe, or across North America. Why was that?
In the Latin American context, there's the Spanish and Portuguese settlers, and there are also the indigenous inhabitants. I mean, it's hard to kind of generalize across Latin America because there are so many different groups, a wide variety of indigenous groups in Latin America. As a result of the Iberian conquest, ended up, mixing with Spanish and Portuguese settlers. Latin America also has a history of slavery, so there were also many people who were brought over as part of the slave trade from Africa. So this idea of race mixing is one that has been picked up in a lot of different places in Latin America, and this idea that that race is difficult to see or doesn't exist in the same way in Latin America has been picked up in several countries because of this history of race mixing. But at the same time, one of the things that's also been notable in the region is that despite the inability to kind of create clear-cut distinctions between the races, there's also been a real privileging of sort of lighter skin color, and there's been a kind of a hierarchy that has been created sort of based around lighter skin color. So this doesn't mean that the region is that racism doesn't exist in the region. Rather, it just means that it's taken a different form.
After World War II, science had a lot to answer for. It wasn't the only cause of the war, but race science had been used to justify Nazi policies. And so there was an international push to define race so that history wouldn't repeat itself. A key part of this, and something that Dr. Giriano specializes in, is an effort in 1950 and 1951 for scientists across the spectrum to create statements by an international body called Unesco. These statements attempted to reflect the anthropological and biological knowledge about race at the time and reinforce the idea that scientifically there was no basis for a racial hierarchy.
This period after World War II is a really interesting one, particularly from a historical perspective. They also emphasized the idea that the races are dynamic and not static entities. So they talked a lot about processes like genetic drift, mutation, hybridization, geographic isolation. The idea of kind of the genetic basis or the biological basis of race never goes away. It seems as though like every 10 or 15 years or so, there's sort of a new controversy that erupts where, somebody kind of emerges to sort of proclaim the genetic basis of things like intelligence and the way they're correlated with race. And these debates end up being rehashed over and over again. I've spent a lot of time tracking and following the careers of the social scientific experts who were involved with UNESCO's anti-racism campaigns. And one of the consequences that's become quite apparent to me is that by challenging the idea of fixed biological races, these experts gained a kind of moral authority. They were able to position themselves as kind of anti-racists. A lot of the work that they ended up doing after their involvement with the UNESCO statements was work that was concerned with integrating indigenous groups into their respective countries. And a lot of the language that they used to describe this work still retained a lot of racist baggage. In the context of development projects, anti-racist experts often referred to indigenous groups or Afro-descendant groups as backwards and primitive, and that if they weren't properly educated in kind of modern ways, that that this would pose a major problem for the countries that they lived in.
Certainly, the eugenics movement has had a lot of different and often devastating impacts for populations across the world, and we really just scratched the surface here. Our point is that science can get it wrong. By analyzing this past, we can see where science has been used for unspeakable atrocities. More broadly speaking, this idea of race science has permeated throughout time, resulting in significant impacts for many communities today.
The barriers that I believe students of color face in participating in and pursuing science in academia today are many. One includes the lack of role models, encouragement, and expectations that they are very much capable of being successful in science fields. Also, the lack of opportunities to participate in science programs, either during elementary, secondary school, or post-secondary, and the lack of opportunities is very critical. Unfortunately, universities do not work with racialized communities enough to encourage and create pathways to science fields in the academy or to pursue other fields that are more lucrative.
There were a lot of kind of contradictions inherent within the sort of anti-racist work, particularly thinking about this history in the context of the past year has been really interesting. And in some ways, I see a lot of parallels between what's happened in the past years with the murder of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter protests. I've seen some parallels between our sort of present moment and this moment after World War II. And one of the parallels I've seen is that after the protests of last summer, one of the things that became ubiquitous was the anti-racist reading list, right? This idea that we could somehow read ourselves out of this mess, I think, was one that seemed to really kind of catch on. The problem of racism is one with kind of that deep sort of structural roots. And although education is important, I think it's also important to recognize kind of the limits of that.
Barriers exist at the individual level, but also at the institutional level. So what does it mean historically for international institutions to be part of anti-racist work? And what can the science community do now to remove some of those barriers?
I think these statements would probably also have more weight if scientific disciplines and institutions also owned up to their own history of racism and their own kind of implications in colonial projects.
I believe there are a number of things the science community can do to reduce and remove some of these barriers. They can go about supporting students of color in their early years with different science-focused programs within their communities or their schools. The science community can partner with professional organizations to advance interest in the sciences, and professors should also encourage students coming from different backgrounds and employ inclusive pedagogies that everyone feels welcome. Institutions should recognize the strategic importance of developing an inclusive environment, given that Black, Indigenous, and people of color represent an increasing proportion of graduating high school students. Universities need to be mindful of attracting and advancing these talented young people, and the science community can certainly take the lead in doing that. It's very important for all of our students to know that if science is something they want to pursue, they should go for it. If it makes their heart sing, they should go for it.
So to wrap up, I asked Dr. Sebastian Hilriano and Dr. Denise O'Neill Green if they were adding to a textbook, what would be on their missing page?
If I were adding a missing page to, say, an anthropology textbook or a human biology textbook, I would add a page that demonstrate the ways in which non-Europeans, Black folk or Indigenous peoples have also kind of participated in studies of human variation and even race science. It wasn't hegemonic, it was challenged, it was resisted. People did try to kind of challenge it in important ways.
When I was growing up, I never saw that in my textbooks. And their personal stories of resistance and resilience, along with their pathways to being a scientist and being in the sciences, I think would be critical to have in our textbooks. But also including the benefits of having diverse teams and their ability to outperform homogeneous groups with common values and shared objectives. And lastly, a curriculum that requires students to look at problems from different perspectives and worldviews of different cultures and diverse cultures as they relate to science and technology. It seems as though when I engage some of my colleagues in the sciences, there's this assumption that culture and diversity doesn't necessarily matter, or your worldview doesn't necessarily matter because science is science. It's extremely objective. But in actuality, the identities that we bring to the table when we engage in the sciences do shape the questions we ask, how we go about solving problems, how we pull together teams, how we work together, and how we go about advancing various different knowledges.
Thanks for watching The Missing Pages. We hope this helps to give a more accurate understanding of the history of science and the wide range of peoples who continue to play an important part in our understanding of the world. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and follow us on social media for more content.